Teachers unions conducting homeschool investigations? Black Lives Matter investigating racial discrimination? Vegans inspecting steakhouses? The Fraternal Order of Police deciding police abuse cases? Amazon enforcing warehouse safety standards? Exxon investigating climate change? These are all pretty crazy propositions, right? But across America, we found that some rather controversial nonprofits have been entrusted with enforcing some of the most contentious laws of the day. Let's dive in and explore these, and let's see what's going on right now in Washington, D.C. that shines a light on these oddities. And you just want to lay down. I know, that's what doggies do on camera. Yeah. Hey, Cato, no activity out here. I've seen lots of volunteers on break hanging out, or workers, just not a lot of like dog stuff. Okay. So when government takes a step to allow third parties to enforce, interpret, adjudicate sort of claims, we normally think about this as being the delegation doctrine. Usually we think of administrative agencies carrying this out, but it's been popular in recent days for a variety of for-profit and non-profit organizations to try to step in, especially for small municipalities, smaller governments, where they have a strained budget. And you can think of plenty of examples here. Private prisons is one example where this has popped up. Red light and speeding camera enforcement, something just about every American loves, is another area where this has popped up. And generally the consensus and the issue is that there has to be a clear delegation of very specifically defined statutory duties, and there has to be government oversight so that we have things like due process and basic constitutional liberties that are protected through this third-party enforcement. Let's see how that goes on in this circumstance. So since 1980 in Washington, D.C., the district's law has allowed the enforcement of animal cruelty and welfare provisions not to be housed primarily here with the D.C. Health Department, but instead is delegated to a nonprofit. Many of you have heard, this is the D.C. Humane Rescue Alliance. It's a conglomeration of different nonprofits, one of them being the Humane Society. So what are some of the key powers that were delegated by government to the nonprofit? Well, the first is D.C. law says that the Humane Rescue Alliance can actually engage in arrests. They can go out and arrest individuals for violations of the law. They have the power to issue search warrants, to be able, what you might think of with the police functioning is actually done by a nonprofit. They are not subject to traditional FOIA or Freedom of Information requests. So you have to instead start with the Department of Health and go through a big maze to be able to get to anything relevant to what they're doing. That creates some level of immunity, or at least obscurity, for them in performing their governmental functions. And what we've learned recently too is it's not bad enough that a nonprofit who seems pretty zealous about animal rights issues is in charge with enforcing them. Well, guess who's the judge? That's right, members of the Animal Humane Society. In fact, its president, Miss LaFontaine, is in charge of all adjudications of animal cruelty in the District of Columbia. Let's see how that shakes out. So one of the problems in the area of delegation is that when government chooses to delegate, it needs to pick areas that are pretty well defined and that most Americans agree on. And an inherent problem with animal abuse and welfare law is sort of defining exactly what that is, because Americans have many different definitions about what might constitute animal abuse. Here's an example. We think about cat decline. Proponents of cat decline, where they actually take out a bone on the cat's foot, say that this is a humane thing to do because they're providing a home and a habitat for the cat that's safe, and they don't want them to destroy their inner living room, their favorite sofa, or their couch. But opponents of this say this is a very cruel way to treat our feline friends, and that you're inflicting actual injury and harm to the cat. There's no great agreement in America over this issue. Similar thing arises when we talk about dog ear docking. You can see this famously in Dobermans, for example, where a surgery is performed to make the ears lay in a particular way. Now, proponents of it say this is actually a health benefit for Dobermans because it helps prevent any sort of future injury that the dogs would have from their ordinary ear structure. Opponents, of course, say that you're just doing an unnecessary operation for the vanity and look of the dog that causes real injury to it. But Americans get divided about these. How about letting cats run free on the streets if you live in a city center? This is something Americans get upset about as well. Is that abuse because they go out and they might get hurt, and they certainly do damage to the bird population nearby? Environmentalists have called this out. Or is this actually a boon to cats and good for their psychology, good for their behavior to be able to do a walkabout every day? So when we delegate sort of controversial issues that are rather subjective, and we let third parties who have a vested interest in that carry out justice, mete out justice, well, folks, I don't think you'll be too surprised to learn that some controversies arise. Another issue that comes up frequently when we look at animal rights groups enforcing animal abuse laws nationwide is that human beings have to enforce it. And what we find is that in so many court proceedings, there are records of petty enforcement actions going after the smallest infractions, a rabies vaccine paperwork being filed a week late, a cage being an inch too small, rather than focusing on real instances of neglect and abuse that everyone would care about. And so when we see these sorts of activities mounting up, it suggests there's a problem in the enforcement mechanism, something we'll be exploring as we talk about this more. That's a good boy. Nobody wakes up in the morning wanting to abuse fuzzy animals, our friends like Cato here. We're going to talk about somewhat contentious issues today because we're going to be balancing the desire that we have to protect our furry friends like Cato against neglect and real abuse. Nobody wants that, right, bud? But we also need to make sure that the rights of owners, constitutional liberties, remain protected too. So as we do this video, we're going to try to make sure that we keep our feelings about our fuzzy friends in one hand, and at the same time, in the other hand, we think about what a fair process looks like and what the protection of civil and constitutional liberties might look like. And in that way, we can reach a sensible and fair outcome on this. Right, bud? That's right. That's right. All right, let's go take a look. Oh, here we go. Oh, now I'll tell you what, this guy is really excited about today's content, and I hope you're just as excited as Cato is to dig into it. So we're here in front of the Humane Rescue Alliance in Washington, D.C., in Tacoma Park. I want to talk about some of the structural problems that we often find when government delegates powers to nonprofits. The first problem that comes up is, imagine if you're playing a sports game and we were to give the referee $100 for each time he calls a foul or a penalty that's out in the field. You can imagine what would happen with the game. Well, it's really curious in DC because the Humane Rescue Alliance, again, it's charged with the enforcement, it is charged with adjudication here, judge, jury, and executioner. Imagine what would happen if they were allowed to keep every dollar for every enforcement action that were taken on their behalf. Well, that's exactly what the law has set up. And to me, that's a string of perverse incentives. It encourages a group with an ideological focus to go after those wrongs in society it sees and incentivizes them to be able to keep that money to grow their budget. And that doesn't necessarily produce sort of a neutral dispassionate justice that we might expect from a judiciary and from an enforcement program in government. So the second point that's of concern is when we deal with areas that aren't objective, where there's very little clear black and white, and we have subjective determinations about what animal care and animal welfare looks like, we get into a dangerous area. We're putting a group with an ideological focus in charge of making some very subjective determinations. So that'd be like if we hired the Black Lives Matter to be able to go out and say that they were to make determinations about police abuse. Or if you don't like that example, what if we hired the Police Benevolent Association to be able to make those same determinations about police abuse? In one instance, you'd have findings all the time of abuse. In the other instance, we wouldn't have any. And that's a contested issue in America about what appropriate and proper policing looks like. So we should be really careful when we take hotbed issues that Americans don't agree about with subjective and vague standards, and we just hand them over to a third party to be able to not just enforce, but adjudicate as they do in Washington, D.C. Here's a third problem that we have with this delegation to a nonprofit. Imagine entrusting a nonprofit with very adjudication of these contested issues. So constitutionally, every American has a right to fair and impartial justice. But the first step for justice in D.C. for animal abuse issues is not a dispassionate government body court. It's going to see these folks. And in fact, they've put the president in charge of making determinations about animal abuse issues. That raises a problem also because constitutionally, we have due process protections. And we find those in how we have what are called burdens of proof. If they want to be able to show that there was actual abuse or neglect of an animal, they have to be able to hit a certain evidentiary threshold to prove that. And that creates a fairness for people who have been claimed to have violated the law. It also gives you firm standards by which you know you're operating within a universe. An opposite of this might be taken from the old-time comic Calvin and Hobbes, where we did Calvin Ball. And what Calvin Ball is when Calvin's got the ball and he's winning, any attempt that makes him lose or push him back is a violation of the rules, and they get made up at any moment. We don't want Calvin Ball in any series of sort of serious judicial proceedings in America. But evidentiary standards are not clearly spelled out in the DC Code, and it's unclear that they're actually being carried out when the Humane Society, the Humane Rescue Alliance, carries out its function. That's a real critical constitutional problem in the system. Moreover, there's a Fifth Amendment issue that comes here. Now, some folks aren't going to like exactly the framing of this, but pets are normally seen as property in the American system of justice. Whether you like that or not is sort of not relevant for today. But with that comes certain rights. So pet owners have a property right in their pets, and if the folks at the Humane Rescue Alliance seize your animals, take them away, as they are prone to do for minor infractions, then the deprivation of that property means that you should have certain constitutional safeguards in place. If you're stuck dealing with these folks for 2 years, trying to figure out where your pet Cato is going to go and how he's being taken care of, that deprivation of that property, or of my lovely little friend, means something. And we should have a remedy for that abuse. Another problem inherent in these sort of delegation to private entity cases is we can look to a whole host of examples going on. The Missouri Supreme Court struck down something Americans always love to complain about, the red light camera systems where private corporations take over the adjudication and enforcement of these. And they did so because of the lack of due process protections for average taxpayers coming in and having their rights essentially adjudicated by a private for-profit corporation. You can imagine the problems that would be inherent in that. We've seen problems similarly so in civil asset forfeiture cases where someone who just suspected of having a criminal violation has their property seized. And this has led to reform nationwide. My law partner, Steve Klein, has been a lead on pushing for reform in this area. And it's an important area where government regularly abuses that. Imagine giving that power to a third-party private entity. Or there's the Kids for Cash scandal in Pennsylvania. And there, a private penitentiary system for children was paying off judges to make sure that kids would get sent to their facilities. So we have a whole host of problems when we line up financial incentives with enforcement programs and with adjudication. And I can't imagine it being any different in this scenario. Lastly, this sort of is outside of the legal considerations, but there's been a lot of public debate and discussion about how well the Humane Rescue Alliance has actually been running these programs for Washington, D.C. The DCist ran a story in 2023 about the fact that maybe the care here wasn't all that grand, that in fact there was instances of reports of dogs not being taken out on a daily basis, that they were in their own urine, in their own feces. And there was an outcry about those issues. Was the actual organization entrusted with their care committing abuse and neglect as well? And then there was an analysis of the CEO's, the president's salary of nearly $350,000, as well as other executives who had very high, in the high 200s to high 100s, $1,000 salaries too. Was that the best way to spend money to take care of these particular programs to help our fuzzy friends? All that sort of debate and public discussion led to changes in the law for 2025 such that the care of animals has gone back to Washington, D.C., but by all apparent research that I've seen, the enforcement and adjudication is still held by a private party. Interesting. One important note that we should probably try to differentiate is that when we think about these nonprofits, there's the American Humane Society, and of course that was part of this conglomeration of the nonprofit in Washington, D.C. The national organization is something that's very different from what we see from local charters around the United States, which each have different tastes, different flavors. But the national organization undercame quite a bit of scrutiny in the fact that it has radical positions that many Americans disagree with. One of those positions is simply placing heavy-handed restrictions on livestock and agricultural operations, restrictions that would make it difficult for many small and family farms to be able to operate. The second thing that they do is restrictions on scientific research and use of animals. That's a hotly contested issue in America, with some folks favoring more rigorous research on animals and others wanting more rights and protection in place. So when we think about an area of law and an area of policy where Americans are sharply divided, it's very difficult to entrust one side of that debate with an enforcement and an adjudication power. And I think that cautions that we should maybe back off and give a little space for different parties to have their voices heard, rather than entrusting with one side with a grand enforcement power to be able to ensure its ideological view is going to be enforced. Another thing we should do is pause and reflect. How has this experiment worked in other jurisdictions, other parts of the United States, even in Canada? When you take a core government function, examining animal abuse and animal welfare, and then delegate it to a third-party private organization to be able to enforce and sometimes adjudicate these matters. Well, in 2017, the Lancaster chapter of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals had a similar arrangement there too. And it found itself on the wrong end of judicial actions because allegations were coming in that this particular Lancaster County chapter was really focusing on minor technical violations of animal rights law. That is, if you had a rabies tag that was 1 week expired, they were going to move in with excessive fines. It was charged that they were interested in a sort of enforcement first, education second sort of policy. So coming in and capturing animals and removing them for petty and small violations, to be able to capture fines, to be able to show their power, while leaving real animal neglect and real animal abuse still out there, because those are more difficult cases to process and require generally more resources from the organization. The second complaint that was lobbied against them was that they're human beings and they carried out their enforcement in discriminatory and petty sort of ways. So what did that look like? Everybody has folks and individuals they might not like all that much or just might not understand. And when you entrust other human beings with their own biases, with their own prejudices to enforce the law, and you give them few standards, well, then you shouldn't be too surprised to see that they might enforce the law against folks they don't understand or don't like all that much. So it's not just in America. We can go to Ontario, Canada. There was a similar scenario there where the Society for the Prevention for Cruelty of Animals had played a significant role in enforcing the province's animal cruelty and welfare laws. And that went through litigation in the Canadian courts. And guess what? Similar trends revealed themselves. Those trends were there was an enforcement first, sort of rigorous gotcha sort of attitude by the animal rights organizations who would go out and they would measure, for example, shelters that seemed to be 1 inch off of the size that was allowable. In a confiscation first, ask questions second approach to dealing with animal welfare issues, the court found that there were oftentimes petty infractions that were deemed to be violations of the law, and that there was a lack of focus on the true core issues of animal neglect and animal abuse. This has been in Canada. We've seen this happen in Pennsylvania, and there's been case law in New Jersey that has shown this too, with petty factions fighting these issues out and attacking one another. It seems to be a very strange way to advance animal justice and a concern for animal abuse and welfare by having a sort of kangaroo court system and vying factions who impose sometimes a radical ideology on the American public to try to carry out a basic task, preventing animals against the worst sort of abuse and neglect. I think we can do better. Let's explore how. So there are a few key takeaway points that I just want to sum up here. The first is, the part of me that's very much focused on good governance and efficient operation of government suggests that, there's a number of instances where partnering with private organization is going to bring a more efficient and better delivery of government services. But I think that works best when we're dealing with situations where we have objective standards and precious constitutional liberties don't seem to be in jeopardy. So what's an example of that? A toll road. It's hard to imagine a toll road operated by a private operator that's going to limit and say that only Christians can operate it, or that only Republicans are allowed to use the express lane. That's sort of absurd. But as we move into areas that carry more constitutional significance, I think we need to be worried about delegating this to third parties, or at least that when we do so, that we're very strict and limited in how they operate. Second, I think that we need to be very careful in subjective areas. Again, what is animal abuse and what is animal welfare? Is allowing a cat to run free on the streets a form of abuse? Is declawing a cat a form of abuse? These are issues that are highly contested and disagreed upon by the American public. You don't want to give one side of a debate that enforcement power or that adjudication power to be able to decide these issues. You want to let these resolve peacefully in society so that we come to an agreed upon standard and we can later enforce that. Third, there's important constitutional issues here that are at bay. Due process rights, the right to a fair and impartial hearing, evidentiary standards, Fifth Amendment rights, a whole host that don't seem to be present or at least strongly delineated in what we saw in DC law, and I suspect are probably missing in other areas in the country. We know from research that areas like Toledo and Philadelphia, areas of New York, other areas in Pennsylvania have similar programs that are carried out and all carry these sort of constitutional frailties. I think all of the research and all of the interviewing we've done suggests that we return to first principles, that we have an eye on taking care of our fuzzy friends, and we do so with a respect for the rule of law and for constitutional freedoms. Look, none of us want to end up in the next episode of Raiders of the Lost Kennel. Neither myself nor Lacy here. just because we misfiled a vaccine report. But handing over power to private groups to pursue these sorts of minor and petty violations is like giving all the power to one of those sheriffs in the old Western films where the gunfights are started just because of missed paperwork. It's nonsense. What we want to do is work to respect the rule of law while respecting animal rights at the same time. I think that's something we both can agree on, Lacy. Look, we love our furry companions. That's right. But it doesn't mean that we somehow abandon the rule of law because of it. As I said before, we can have both interests at hand. Animal welfare rights, the real kind that protect against abuse and neglect, and a respect for due process of law, constitutional and civil liberties. So let's keep the system honest. Let's channel that passion we have for protecting real animal rights against neglect, against abuse, into a system that also respects due process and comports with constitutional norms. We shouldn't face a SWAT team just because we filed a rabies booster a week late. Let's preserve real animal rights against neglect and abuse while preserving the rule of law. What do you say, Lacy?
Outtakes.